4 main vents.
Open 3 and 4 main vents.
The submarine has been pushed out on a timetable and not repaired properly. It's not fit to sail.
This was not a mutiny. The word mutiny is being misused here. The commanding officer gave them the option of representing their worries, which they did through the divisional system. And out of a duty of care to those individuals, we decided to land them for further psychiatric and stress counselling.
This is a story about why, 4 months ago, 11 Devonport-based submariners left HMS Trafalgar after individually raising various concerns with their captain about safety. Some facts about engineering details are in dispute, but for 11 submariners to take this unprecedented action raises serious questions. At the centre of the story is a 25-year-old operator-mechanic from Plymouth, James Metcalfe. His words are spoken by an actor.
All the crew knew there were problems. The majority I spoke to said if they had the guts, they would be there with me. Morale on board Trafalgar is at an all-time low.
Everyone on board a submarine has gone through a particularly rigorous and a particularly special training scheme. Ever since the start of the submarine service, submariners have considered themselves a race apart. There is a remarkable camaraderie in the submarine service. So you're very much in the forefront of the Navy. There's a certain elitism here. And this, I think, leads many people to volunteer for what they regard as the premier part of the Royal Navy.
The young lads are worried because they'd seen the old lads refusing to sail. The 11 of us have a lot of experience. We have more than 100 years between us. It wasn't just a group of young lads that were scared about going to sea. There was no mutiny. It was more a vote of no confidence in the submarine, taken by us individually.
James Metcalfe's remarks led the Daily Mirror to make a number of allegations. That the submarine was unable to drop anchor, that hydraulic oil leaked into the boat's drinking water, that there was a shortage of breathing equipment, a broken emergency air valve, and that emergency gas canisters leaked. The Navy issued a 2-word statement in response to these claims: not true.
HMS Trafalgar recently completed a major repair at Devonport. Rigorous checks were undertaken to validate all aspects of her seaworthiness prior to sailing. Recent press reports alleging that the vessel was in an unfit condition to proceed to sea were completely unfounded.
The Navy said the 270 separate faults with the submarine were nothing to worry about.
The SSN, the nuclear-powered submarine, is the most complex machine ever built by man. And it also equates to a small town at sea. You've got your power plant, your sewage plant, your hotels, your restaurants, your roads, your lighting. And you name me a town that is 100% defect-free the whole time. Such is the complexity that you're not going to be able to have 100% of all your machinery working perfectly all the time.
One of the complaints raised by crew members concerned the vessel's nuclear reactor. This was potentially so serious that the reactor had to be shut down. It happened while Trafalgar was in dock. But if it had happened while she was in the middle of the ocean, it could have been far more serious.
And it's all happening here within the manoeuvring room, taking control of the reactor, which is about the shape of the size of a dustbin. And the control rods are those rods which dampen down the fission process. Any abnormality in the withdrawal of those rods will be very quickly detected, and it can be caused, for example, by a rod control motor blowing a fuse or something. It immediately becomes apparent. So the answer is, and it's a standard procedure, push the rods back in, or in fact allow them to drop back in, investigate the problem, and then re-continue the process. Safety is paramount.
My Lords, there was a minor problem with the single control rod. This is a minor defect in the design authority, which originally designed the reactor plant, Rolls-Royce, I think the House would agree, a fairly respectable UK company, have agreed that the submarine was safe to sail. That decision has been agreed by the Ministry of Defence experts and, just to put the cherry on the cake, independently assessed by MOD's independent nuclear auditors.
But most submariners are not nuclear experts.
Until they start to throw more money into maintenance, one of the submarines will go down. A lot of the lads believe that. There's only so much you can push your luck. None of us mind going to sea. We've all been in recent conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan. But I'm not putting my life on the line for a training exercise.
The submariners also claimed civilian contractors had rewired an emergency motor backwards. They say this could have had the effect of dragging the submarine down. The Navy says that when a new motor is fitted, there is a 50-50 chance that it will start in reverse mode, and that's why it's tested before putting to sea.
It actually sits just here, and it's mechanically lowered hydraulically from this position. And obviously the wiring, it was wired back to front, wouldn't have been noticed until it was run. Not a serious issue, and had absolutely no implication for ship safety.
Many of the alleged faults were identified at the end of a 15-month refit at Devonport Dockyard. A crucial question is whether the refit work is carried out in such a way that safety might be compromised. The Health and Safety Executive, in its reports on Devonport, has said more emphasis needs to be placed on safety awareness. The Nuclear Installations Inspectorate has also claimed there is scope to improve the safety culture.
When the Chief Inspector and the Deputy Director General were at Devonport, they noticed a number of instances where a small number of people were not behaving in the way we would normally expect. We treat these very seriously. If we had grave concerns, and if we were concerned that there were real nuclear safety issues, we have the powers to stop activities. This was not the situation that was faced here. We are working actively and constructively with all the workers and management at Devonport to improve standards and to enhance the safety culture.
DML declined to comment on these observations, but separate reports from the Audit Commission and the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee have also raised concern that submarines are being forced to spend longer and longer in refit, denying the Navy the use of what strategically are meant to be vital assets.
We are likely to see cuts in the very near future. If you cut them less, then of course there's less opportunity for you to cover your commitments, and you want refits put in and quickly. You want them done more swiftly, and you are going to use those assets more as well. You're going to sweat those assets more. They're going to be more out on patrol. They're going to spend less time in refit, and so there is a danger there of overstretch. And I suspect that's something that the MOD will want to watch very, very carefully.
No Royal Navy ship or submarine would sail after a maintenance period without satisfactory completion of rigorous safety checks, and a process that is always fully documented. Now, of course, it's not unexpected for there to be minor defects following a period of maintenance. It's the purpose of the testing and training phase to ensure that all the equipment is functioning correctly.
Getting a complete picture of the engineering issues involved here would mean getting hold of a lot more information than the Navy has so far been prepared to release. There are established procedures for reporting faults, and the Navy maintains written records. These records have only a low security classification, and so we naturally have asked to see them, to see precisely who said what to who and when. The Navy has refused to release this evidence. Colin Breed is now writing to the Ministry of Defence to ask why documents relating to health and safety should not be published.
If at all possible, I think it's as well to put everything that they can into the public arena, because I don't think they've got very much to hide in that issue. But I can't say why they haven't. I just think it's unfortunate.
Anti-nuclear campaigners say the potential for disaster is so great that Britain's entire submarine fleet should now be recalled.
We think that if there's concern enough for 11 submariners to walk off a ship, that shows that there are real problems with the submarine. People don't do that without full knowledge of the consequences for them personally. We have real concerns that there could be a serious accident where there's loss of life of the crew, loss of the submarine itself, and of course loss of containment of the reactor.
3.5 up. What he's doing now, 8.4 metres.
The Navy says some of the crew refused to sail because of domestic welfare issues, and that others were suffering from stress. The so-called mutineers disagree.
We refused to sail on it. Without the proper escape equipment, we were not prepared to do it. We had one-to-one chats with the captain. I have nothing against him. The submarine has been pushed out on the timetable and not repaired properly.
The Navy says some crewmen were offered psychiatric counselling because they were reluctant to sail on any submarine, not just HMS Trafalgar. But human rights campaigners say that what's really needed is a whistleblowing culture of safety.
Those in authority mustn't be allowed to use that old chestnut, which we've always had, that military discipline is such that members of the armed forces are denied basic rights. But it can't be used. It can't be used to deny them the right to speak out when their conscience tells them that they must.
The story of the submariners who didn't want to sail on HMS Trafalgar seems in part related to their confidence, or lack of it, in the refit timetable while the vessel was in dock at Devonport. But part of the story is rooted in the recent history of the vessel at sea.
Tonight on West Country Live, sub on the rocks, limping home, another Navy blunder at sea.
10 of the 11 men were on board for the crash in 2002. It shook most of us pretty bad. The Navy would say we are suffering from stress. They're trying to cover up their mistakes.
2, 2, 3. I should have sent them to you.
The accident near the Isle of Skye, which had brought HMS Trafalgar into Devonport for repair, led to the court-martial of 2 officers. How could a submarine collide with a piece of rock which is clearly marked on Navy charts? The answer, according to evidence given at the court-martial, was that the vessel's navigation display was covered with yellow post-it notes, left as reminders from one crew member to another.
That boat was carrying out junior officer training, potential COs, a lot of pressure on them. They worked hard around the clock, and mistakes were obviously made. Submarines are not designed to go around hitting the bottom, but it did happen. The Navy employs human beings the same as your television company, and they do make mistakes.
I think there are 2 dimensions to safety here. There's operational safety and there's technical safety. As far as the safety of the mechanics of the boat are concerned, then there is this obsessive safety culture. As far as the operations of the boat are concerned, there is a policy of calculated risk. Because after all, a submarine is a very tough item. You can, up to a point, take risks with them in order to maintain your skills at operating in shallow water. And the skills of the Royal Navy in operating in difficult waters are probably second to none.
HMS Trafalgar isn't the only nuclear submarine to hit the headlines in recent years.
Good evening. A nuclear-powered submarine was escorted into Plymouth Sound today after developing an electrical...
The Devonport-based nuclear submarine HMS Tireless is limping into Gibraltar after springing a leak in its reactor cooling circuit during exercises in the Mediterranean.
Devonport nuclear submarine HMS Torbay has hit more problems with her refit. A valve failed to shut properly during a practice dive, and it'll now be out of action for another week. Nuclear submarine HMS Torbay has been forced to return to Devonport indefinitely because of problems with her sonar system. The crew couldn't rewind the underwater listening device, which trails behind the sub on a cable.
The incident which forced HMS Tireless to spend nearly a year at Gibraltar eventually forced a re-examination of all our nuclear submarines. The reactor had to be shut down and the boat made its way to Gibraltar on the surface using its standby diesel engines.
It took a lot of time, money and effort to get it right, and because one submarine was down, they looked at all the others. A very prudent move to do all that. And I think that's the Navy comes out of it rather well, in that they do take safety that seriously, that they'll bring the whole fleet in if necessary and just check out the submarine from top to bottom before they let them go back to sea again.
I've heard nuclear-powered submarines compared to space shuttles. They are as complex as that. And there is an almost obsessive safety culture. Certainly in Britain, we have not had a major accident, certainly not one involving the power plant in any of our submarines. There have been problems, but these have always been contained and controlled, and no one has lost their life.
6 months after HMS Trafalgar's 2002 collision near the Isle of Skye, HMS Tireless was on an exercise in the Arctic Ocean.
Meanwhile, the submarine HMS Tireless is expected to return home to Devonport for repairs after hitting an iceberg. The Navy says the nuclear-powered sub suffered minor damage to its forward ballast tanks, but is still quite safe to make its own way home.
Royal Navy submarines have a long history of operating in the Arctic and under the ice. During the Cold War, this was their stock in trade. Quite often, submarines came back with dents in them. Dents perhaps caused by ice, dents perhaps caused by Soviet submarines. I would not like to see submarine commanders being unwilling to take calculated risks. The whole essence of submarining is the taking of calculated risks.
Recently, details emerged of 3 fires on board nuclear submarines at Devonport. Fires which had happened a year earlier. So why didn't the Health and Safety Executive publish those details immediately?
In retrospect, it may well be that it might have been a newsworthy story. We did not view it as such. What was unusual about it was the number of fires there were in the small period. I believe that Devonport took the right actions. We've all looked at what happened to see if there are any lessons that can be learned. Those that have been learned have been put into practice so that in future any possible recurrence has been minimised.
The question now is, would the release of official records and a greater openness with the public be reassuring or alarming?
After 40 years of running nuclear-powered submarines, some of them out of this dockyard we see behind us, and having no major incident, I'm very confident that the very strictest standards are maintained, and I want to see those standards maintained, not just for the submariners, but also for people here in the dockyard area who live so close by.
Any submarine is inherently dangerous. There's always the risk of toxic fumes, battery explosions, and accumulations of carbon dioxide. One of the most high-profile accidents was the disaster 4 years ago, which sank the Russian submarine, the Kursk. 118 men died. Over the past 30 years, at least a dozen nuclear submarines have sunk or suffered serious accidents. Britain has never lost a nuclear submarine, but some campaigners claim it's only a question of time.
What level of degree of accident do we want? How many submariners are we prepared to lose? Are we prepared to lose a submarine but be happy that its reactor is contained on the seabed? You know, these are questions that really have to be delved into. That's why we're calling for an open public inquiry on these submarines and the state of them.
There's no doubt that the Navy does spend a lot of effort making sure that when things go wrong, they can contain the situation and prevent loss of life. Ultimately, though, it comes down to a question of trust.
There is no more highly trained, more skilled, more technically alert outfit, fighting outfit in the world than the Royal Navy. Where events go wrong, we learn from those events, but in absolute fundamental terms, safety is always put first.
It clearly doesn't help the confidence of submariners if, when things do go wrong, they feel they have nowhere else to turn except the newspapers.
Basic health and safety, which would be applicable to submarines, surface ships, or indeed even shore establishments, ought to be no different for any of the naval personnel. And indeed, the regulations and the procedures for reporting those things ought to be identical.
The problem with submarines is that even a straightforward, relatively trivial mechanical fault has the potential for catastrophic consequences. When you're deep underwater, living in a completely artificial environment, the submarine controls every aspect of your life. Often, calling for help simply isn't an option.
The safety checks that are carried out on submarines before they go to sea are unbelievable. Well, before that design things, but you just don't know what is going to fail when the submarine's deep, way out in the Atlantic. You hope and you pray that it doesn't happen, but all the time men go to sea in submarines. Unfortunately, there is a chance of an accident, just there is an accident of driving up the motorway in your car.
Even if something goes wrong, there are procedures, there is a system which can stop things going catastrophically wrong. I would feel much safer in a British nuclear-powered submarine, in any conditions virtually, than crossing a major road.
Tomorrow sees the start of Navy Days, one of the biggest public relations exercises organised by the Ministry of Defence. Anyone can come and look round the Devonport buildings, meet the crews, and go on board some of the fighting ships. If the weather's good, then Navy Days tomorrow is likely to be as successful as ever. A grand day out, plenty of people enjoying themselves, and the recruiting office doing great trade. But the questions about submarine safety raised in this programme are now being raised in Parliament. And sooner or later, the Ministry of Defence is going to have to answer them.